and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant.
This podcast, we continue to explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And today, we are actually, every time we do a podcast, we say we should do a podcast on. One of the things we talked about was military acquisition. And we got quite excited one episode where we talked about the fact that I think in general, the British military, all three services, actually do quite an excellent job at dealing with uncertainty, at tactical flexibility. You know, it's this thing that we can push a bunch of people onto an aeroplane, drop them somewhere in Southeast Asia, and the next thing they know, they're doing some amazing things, like defending an island or building something, but for locals after a hurricane. But we talked about the fact that that's a really interesting concept, because the same organizations that are frankly excellent at flexibility, application of strategy, and delivering effect, then when you talk about acquisition, apparently turn out to be not as good as that.
Yeah, quite. So I think we mentioned it when we did the episode on mission command and operational art. We talked about militaries by evolution. I was going to say by design, but it's by evolution, are good at operational management. So they're good at understanding what needs to be done, and there's that whole mission analysis process that we kind of talked about. They do operational planning, knowing that the plan will never survive contact with the enemy. They do mission command. We've done whole episodes on why that's useful, why it's valuable, and how it works, so that they can be adaptive and responsive to a changing and complex environment that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And yet the same organizations, when given a similar level of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in the project management space, seem to be less capable.
So let's, by the way, before we go any further, I think Gareth probably knows a bit more about military procurement than I do, but I know next to nothing. And you'd be pleased to know this is not going to be an hour-long discussion about the ins and outs of military procurement per se. What I think is interesting is why is this a problem? What can we learn? And actually, are there any key reasons why something that is, where is the difference between that tactical flexibility and procurement? So I'll start. This is actually pulled, for a man who's thinly read. Today I was reading a government document about procurement. So there you go. I am no longer thinly read. I read stuff from Hansard. But it talked about the fact that the Ministry of Defence spend billions each year buying new equipment and supporting existing equipment for the armed forces. By the way, I'm quoted from this. This is the bit I want to say. It has allocated £238 billion on equipment procurement and support over the 10 years from 2021 to 2031. So it turns out this is quite important. There's quite a lot of money. There's quite a lot of capacity and programs that's going to deliver. And yet, if we now go to something else I pulled out from that same report, there was an appendix that talked about in 2022 the forecast delays for selected major programs. So the delay for the Astute Attack Submarine, Boat 5, was 25 months. Protector Unmanned Aerial Vehicle System, 28 months. The Crow's Nest Radar System, so that is airborne early warning for our carrier fleet, 29 months late. Particularly good one, Marshall Air Traffic Management System, 47 months. Warrior Armoured Vehicle Upgrade, 56 months, just before it was cancelled in 2021 by the Integrated Review. And finally, last but by no means least, the A400 transport aircraft, and we were debating how it could be this late, 79 months late.
And these are predictions on how late they're going to be. These are forecasts. So I want to make the point, though, that this is rather than, beating up the military on being shit at procurement. This is more a question of why is it different? And as you said, what are the lessons? But I think large and complex project management programs in general are difficult. This is not a military specific problem set. I think there are certain things that make it harder that we will probably explore, but government-led or public sector big projects and programs of work, when you're dealing with taxpayers' money and all of the complexities that come with that, are difficult. I think what's really interesting for me is the military, and particularly bits of the military that I've come from, pride themselves on their ability to respond quickly to change, to manage and take risk responsibly, to motivate large, complex organizations to achieve strategic goals over the long term as the situation changes, when faced with what are sometimes catastrophic and devastating blows in terms of people's physical safety. And yet, outside of the operational context, we don't seem to have the same cultural approach. We don't seem to have the same process.
There's the first lesson for us. We said glibly in that past episode, why is it the military is good at this thing but not good at that thing? And actually, I think the first thing we proved beautifully is because something looks a bit like another thing, don't mistake those things to be the same. And
that's
actually,
very true.
As I spent a bit of time sort of preparing for this and thinking about the complexities and the challenge, they are very different. And given that this is a sort of management and leadership podcast, there's the first lesson for all of us, which is we all take shortcuts. We all like to think we know the answer, and we go, well, that can't be any harder than this thing that I'm really good at, and it's stupid. Well, let's go back a bit, because there'll be lots of military people listening who, first of all, will be banging their heads against the table because they no doubt will have been involved in one of these activities. But for civilian listeners, can you talk a bit, Gareth, about when we talk about the procurement process? Can you kind of give us a high level view? What actually happens? Like, who is involved? How long does it take? When we say procurement, do we mean buying nuts and bolts, or do we mean buying aircraft carriers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's a complex long answer, and then there's a relatively simple and short answer. Having never worked directly in procurement, but having been involved in lots of the outputs of procurement and capability development projects, I'm not an authority on this, but I think the main thing to point out is that when we talk about the military a lot on this podcast, what we actually mean are the frontline commands. So we talk about the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and then all the other bits and pieces. That is all part of a Ministry of Defence, which is part of government. The Ministry of Defence actually controls all the money. And the Ministry of Defence is made up of the serving members of the armed forces and a whole load of people who are civil servants that work as part of the Ministry of Defence. And so straight away, there is a difference between large projects within the Ministry of Defence for procurement or for developing policy versus the armed forces and elements of the armed forces operating. So firstly, there's a massive difference.
I mean, the first thing to say is effectively you get military officers, be it RAF, Army, Navy, going to a building in London and sitting at a desk, and instead of driving a ship or fighting an aircraft, are working on a project.
They're working on a project. They're also working as a part of a wider team that is made up of a mix of military personnel and civil servants. So there is straight away a cultural difference, and there are different cultural subcultures within the civil service and within the military. And there's a management, command, leadership challenge there to start with.
Who decides that we need a new tank?
So the way it works is each frontline command has a virtual budget. So there is a budgeting process where they work out how much they think it's going to cost over the next 12 months to run the army and to run the Air Force and to run the Navy. And then within that, there is a discussion around what new capabilities are going to be required. And some of that is fairly predictable. So you, based off what equipment you've currently got and how long you think that's going to last for, you can start to predict when you're going to need the next tank, ship, aircraft, individual weapon system, whatever it is. Some of this is big projects, the procurement of a ship. Some of this is really small fry,
A new rifle.
a new helmet, or whatever. And of course, that's small fry in terms of the unit cost of the thing and how complex it is. But that could still be a very large program because you need lots of them, or it could be a very small amount of very small things. And so there are levels of delegation to give people virtual budget authority to buy stuff up to certain levels.
So I think to cheat, I think where you're going was that there's things that are clearly obvious we need to get, like new rifles, but there may be new capabilities that we've never had before. So whether it's old or new, and I think this is just as interesting whether it's old or new, who decides on the requirements? But I think we'll, in my world of product management, getting the requirements right and not having those requirements change all the time is a key thing. Who decides what the requirements of this new rifle, this new helmet, or this new tank are?
Yeah, before we get to that, it's worth pointing out that there's also things that cost money that are disposable. So fuel, food, salaries, all of these things. So they all need to be budgeted for as well. And the amount that they're going to get used will be predictable to a greater or lesser extent. So people, you can kind of predict how much they're going to cost because you know how many you've got. You've got trend data on how many people are going to leave, how many people are going to promote, how much. So you can kind of predict a lot of this stuff. When it comes to capability, and this is probably very similar for other parts of government, and it's certainly very similar for other parts of the commercial world that run financial projects and forecasting, you're now talking about replacing what you've currently got with like for like because things wear out. So computers are going to need to be replaced every 5 years or whatever, versus how we're going to operate in the future. And that's where it gets tricky. So we've already started to bring out a few things that make this really, really difficult. Before we then talk about who decides what these capabilities are and who makes the judgment. Forecasting of capability is based off previous projects and how long you think things are going to be in service for. And when those projects were going through their procurement and in-life management processes, they were making assumptions and predictions about what would be coming next. And so there's assumptions now starting to be built on assumptions. The next thing that becomes complicated and very quickly becomes complex is you're having to now bring in people's assessments and assumptions about very intangible things like what is the threat from which we need to defend ourselves.
The classic line, prepare for the last war, we should prepare for the next war.
Yes.
Which is great, but given that we have a very bad track record of predicting what the next war is.
So yes, that's really complex. Working out what the threat is, what is the role of the various bits of defence in achieving the task of defence. So there is a national defence strategy that says what we're for, but it doesn't go down into the individual detail of, battalions in the army are for X, Y, Z, because it's a strategy. And then you've got, how is new technology going to change? And that will change in terms of what we can do and what we might want to buy or develop to have better capability. But it will also affect what the threat is and what other people are doing. And therefore, we need to start thinking about new capabilities to mitigate capabilities that the enemy might have. Then all of that is couched within the uncertainty and the ambiguity of how much money are we going to get in the next budget? And of course, the Ministry of Defence is one of many departments across government, and every government has an agenda, a manifesto, has to think about balancing priorities. And the military is not exempt from that, because this is all part of the national strategy. And of course, it might in isolation seem perfectly rational to say, well, you've got to ring fence defence of the country, and therefore, of course, we've got to keep the military budget at 2% of GDP because that's a NATO commitment. But of course, you could equally argue that it's the government's duty to engender prosperity by investing in infrastructure, or protecting the people by investing in the NHS. So you don't know how much you've got. This very quickly becomes where strategy and policy collide, and we can talk about that as well. And then I think this leads very quickly into the way we used to do it, the way we currently do it, the way we potentially need to do it in the future. And part of that comes down to the fact that military technology development for a long time was unique. A lot of technologies that we rely on in everyday life come from things as a result of military, particularly US investment in military development. And of course that can extend to things like, the National Aeronautical and Space Agency. So you've got DARPA and NASA and all of that kind of stuff. That sort of monopoly on technological development has waned over the last 30, 40 years, to a point where actually there is far more investment and technological development as a result of the entertainment industry, the gaming industry, the automotive industry. And we're starting to see, some of the dominant organizations in artificial intelligence and autonomy are tech companies and vehicle manufacturers, like commercial, cars and lorries, not militaries. And so the old process of what do we need? Well, we need to replace the artillery system that we've got, or we need to replace the aircraft carriers with new aircraft carriers, isn't as easy as, well, we also therefore need to be investing in the latest radars or the latest ballistics or whatever, because actually some of the leading technological developments are happening in the commercial world. And so it becomes less about a process of the concept development and the research, and actually becomes more about how do we get the suitably qualified expertise from the commercial sector to support the military.
I think the most recent example of that, of course, is drone technology, where, Ukraine, you read in the newspapers, are talking about next year or this year building, I don't know, it was 1 million drones or 10,000 drones. These are all commercial drone technology they're building. There was an article recently that the military had converted a number of Land Rover Defenders to electric. And this was done with great fanfare, of course, because I'm sure for some people that's a very popular thing. I read the comments on almost every forum I could find, and they were universally, this is stupid. When you're fighting the enemy, where are you going to plug in your electric vehicle and all this kind of stuff? And it struck me, there are military applications for vehicles that are not petrol or diesel. So, this thing is quiet because it doesn't start up and belch smoke everywhere. But more to the point, one day there will not be any diesel engines left, and the military better start figuring out what it means to have electric. And the statement, well, you're not going to be able to charge your car on a battlefield. Yes, you won't be able to. So we better come up with a solution for that.
Yeah.
So it was, I think this idea of the modern complexity and being led, it is the civilian world that is leading to notionally the broad downfall of the traditional engines. I thought that was a very intelligent, we need to understand this better, and fine, we're going to get some quiet Land Rovers. Maybe that's important, maybe it isn't. But if all of a sudden we stick our heads in the sand and say, electric, it's nonsense, one day the enemy is going to have all electric vehicles and we're going to go, bugger, what do we do now? So I lots of complexity, I think.
Yeah, I think that, so I'm quite looking forward to the point where we stop defending why this is so difficult and start tearing defence apart for the way it does procurement. But I think that's a really interesting point, because what you're contesting with there is people's oversimplification of complex problems, and hopefully we started to allude as to why some of these things become complicated or complex. What you're also having to deal with is people's reticence to deal with the uncertainty of the future. So a lot of people, and as this podcast goes out, we're only a month and a half since the army has lifted its restriction on growing beards. And I am amazed at how much reaction that gets as a conversation versus actual operational decisions about capability, about restructuring, about what the threat is perceived to be, about actual things that matter. I don't want to trivialize growing beards, but it is trivial. And the argument is simple. It's, does growing beards affect operational capability? And there's an argument to say, well, you can't wear a respirator. Well, it turns out you can shave. So, we don't carry respirators with us all the time, in the same way that I don't have a rifle with me all the time, when I was in the Marines. We can prepare to go on operations. So straight away, that's easy. The second question is, does it erode discipline or the public perception of what they expect from the military? Well, there are lots of militaries who do it successfully. The Navy do it, the RAF do it, and I don't think they have a particularly different perception from wider society. But what's really interesting is some of the biggest naysayers of this are from the veteran community, because it's change. And so what you're dealing with is the human response of seeking refuge and comfort in the way we've always done things. And I've talked about this in the past. So part of the challenge of procurement is, you're talking about the uncertainty of the future. You have to make some fairly bold decisions. And some of those are going to be wrong. Some of that is going to be based on incomplete assessments, not understanding, what you don't know. And part of it is simply going to be the case of, when you're trying to build your capability and military capability, you are building it against a whole range of future scenarios that you need to be prepared for, some of which will happen, some of which won't happen, some of which may happen if you don't prepare, but if you do, they're far less likely to happen. And therefore, the whole point of deterrence, and we are a defense organization, not an offense organization, is that if you prepare for war, the chances of war are greatly diminished. So things will seem like an absolute waste of money, because you've spent billions of pounds of taxpayers' money building capabilities that won't see the action, or hopefully won't see the action, that they were designed to do. And so it's really easy to criticise.
Well, let's go to a break in a second. Now, you want us to criticise a bit more.
It's not perfect, let's say that.
The National Audit Office, when they were talking about the Crow's Nest airborne early warning, and there are some listeners I know who are involved in that broad community of whirly things that lift up in the air and carry things. The quote from the National Audit Office was, neither the department nor industry understood the complexities of delivering the capability. That is the best diss I've ever heard from the NAO, because it says, yeah, you had no idea the difficulty of what you're delivering. So I tell you what, let's take a quick break, and actually let's go back then, and let's actually dig into some of those skills, because I think that's probably interesting to tease those apart and see where we can learn stuff from, and where they find the challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we do, it's worth exploring why the military, because we've already now talked about why big government procurement projects are difficult. It's probably worth exploring whether that is different in the commercial sector. And let's start looking at why the military is particularly bad at this.
And spoiler alert, I think you only have to look at things like HS2 and a number of other commercial projects to say, Well, I work in software development, and I would be struck down by a bolt of lightning if I did admit, it's quite difficult to work out how long these things will take or how much these will cost. All right, we'll see you straight after the break. Welcome back. Well, I think we've talked about how bad they can be in the military, but we've also started to delve into, I think, what some of the challenges are. As I was sort of preparing for this, I wanted to look at some of the things, to your point, that actually make it really difficult. And yes, I think while we're talking about military procurement, I think this talks about projects and management of projects wherever they are. And so the first two that I've written down, I think, are really general factors, and you've talked about them. So there is complexity and uncertainty. And in fact, we spent 20 minutes talking about building for uncertainty. I talked about crow's nest airborne early warning. What does it need to look like in this new world where we now have drone attacks?
You asked earlier about who gets to feed into the requirements, and I think this is where we start to realise where defence could be better, and we are getting better at this, and we are learning lessons. But what will typically happen is they will go to the air community. Now, Crow's Nest is an airborne early warning system designed specifically to protect shipping. So they will go to the air community of the Navy, the Fleet Air Arm, and say, right, what do you need? And that makes logical sense because that's where the capability is going to sit. They will also go to, and they'll get a variety of stakeholders. And there's an organisation called DENS. It is the procurement arm of the MOD, and they will build a project management team, and then they will do stakeholder analysis. But the initial requirement comes from those frontline commands themselves. And so the Navy will say, we need this capability because we've got this capability gap. And then there are a variety of ways that they look at capability to understand those gaps. But one of them is to war game. And they war game against scenarios that they need to be prepared for, which range from full up warfighting with a peer adversary who is as capable as we are, all the way through to humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and all the rest of it. What we struggle with is where you get crossover between lots of different parts of defence that need to have a stake in how a capability comes together. So, and there are dominant cultures as well that will drive capability from their perspective, and because they are the dominant culture, they will get listened to more. And a good example of that is the fast jet community. So we had Paul Tremelling on as a fighter pilot who went on to be a huge part of the F-35 program. And in Paul's book and on the podcast, Paul talked about how important the F-35 is and how capable it is as an aircraft. I come from a world where I need aircraft. I don't really care about how they fly. I don't really care about how suitable they are to the pilot because that's not my world. Somebody else needs to do that. But I care about how they can deliver effect to me on the ground. And then latterly in my career, when I cared more about surveillance and reconnaissance, I care about what sensors they've got and how they can get that information to me or to my intelligence teams or to the Marines going ashore to help them with their decision making. It's interesting. My experience of the F-35 program was far more frustrating than Paul's because it was driven by an aircrew community, and therefore it is a very, very capable and very good aircraft. Is it as good as it could be at getting information off? And a lot of things retrospectively had to be changed.
Well, I'm going to play my product manager trump card here because let's pick Crow's Nest as an example that I know nothing about, but I can imagine. If you go to the makers of Crow's Nest and say your job is to see backfire bombers at a range where we can prevent them hitting the fleet, that is one set of capabilities that will drive a certain kind of radar. If the next person knocks on the door and says, we've got skiffs just off the Somali coast, and I want you to see those skiffs that are this size and sail this fast, hang on a minute, that's probably a different kind of radar, a different kind of technology. And if the third person comes along and says, we think now those nasty enemies are going to have little motorboat torpedo robot things like we see in Ukraine, again, now we get to the point where you can't design something effectively that solves all those problems. The first problem I think we're coming across, particularly in the military, particularly when it's a platform that is going to have to be there for many, many years, is if you start to load up too many things, it will not do any of them very well.
Yeah.
We see the Tornado multi-role aircraft, which was a terrible fighter, not a particularly good bomber. It was as good as we could make it. But if you'd have said, how do I best shoot down aircraft, it wouldn't have been the Tornado.
Yeah, there's some really good examples of where procurement projects have been overloaded by trying to do everything and be the jack of all trades, and they end up being a bit shit at everything. And
there's a film
on the Bradley armored fighting vehicle.
Film about the fact that every year they kept changing what it was supposed to do.
Yes.
Someone wanted it, like, it's going to swim now.
Yeah.
We don't want it to swim. No, it's going to swim.
Yeah.
It's going to have a big gun because we need a bigger gun. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if it's going to have a bigger gun, it's going to be in the fight for longer, so it's going to need to be up armored. Well, we'll just put less people in it, but it's an armored personnel carrier. And
6 people.
yeah, absolutely. And so you end up with this, there is always that. And of course, with something like Crow's Nest, it's fitted onto a helicopter. It's a radar on a helicopter. And so there will be air safety restrictions. There will be weight restrictions on landing on the deck. The deck weight of a ship will be limited. There will be weather factors you have to think about. So you're designing a piece of equipment or getting a piece of equipment that has to survive foresight gales and getting covered in salt water every day. And so there's lots and lots of things, and these things become very, very complex. And that's just when you're talking about the physical capability. We have a thing called the defense lines of development to help us with this. And that's looking at the holistic project, not just from the perspective of the piece of equipment, but how it's going to build capability. And what we look at, or what we try to look at, is training. So how difficult is it going to be to use? Are we going to need to have bespoke training courses for it? Are we going to need instructors? Who's going to train those instructors? Where are they going to come from? What jobs are they not going to be doing if they're now instructing on this new piece of equipment? How much time in the program are we dedicating to that training? Because once you start taking time out to go and train on a piece of equipment, you're now not training at whatever else you're doing. So you're losing capability elsewhere. The equipment itself, and we've talked about all of the factors involved in buying a physical piece of equipment. The personnel. You can look at personnel from two perspectives. One is the personnel and the team that need to use that equipment, but also the effect of that equipment on personnel. So if it's a piece of, if it's a vehicle, there's the human factors of being in that vehicle.
You're referring to Ajax.
Ajax is a good example, but we
delayed for 14 months because the kit that we had installed vibrated, and therefore people became deaf. In fact, I couldn't believe this. Did you know 14 people were invalided out of the British Army because of that?
Because the next one is then information and intelligence. So that's everything from what information do people need to know about using that equipment. So that could be things like maintenance schedules. How do you know how many miles a vehicle is driven before it needs to have an oil change? Or how many track miles is an armoured vehicle allowed to do before it needs to have the tracks replaced? Or all the way through to what intelligence does it provide, the sensors that it has on it, who's it sharing that with? And then there's a whole load of stuff about, bandwidth and frequencies and sharing the electromagnetic spectrum and signatures that creates, counter detection. There's a whole load of stuff that you can just talk about information and intelligence. Then there's doctrine and concepts. So how does this fit within our way of fighting? How does this change the way that we're going to fight? does this give us opportunities? Does it stop us doing things that we're used to doing? We talked in a previous podcast about how the Germans made really good pieces of individual equipment, but they hadn't thought about how it was going to fit within the German way of fighting, but they became burdens on the logistical support chain rather than capabilities that added a huge amount of capability. So the Tiger tank is a classic example, where the King Tiger, the Germans destroyed more King Tigers to stop them falling into the hands of the enemy, because they had a tendency to run out of fuel and they couldn't be towed away because they were so big. So they destroyed their own to stop them falling into the hands of the enemy.
Great fact.
Versus
destroyed.
Than how many were destroyed by us. Organization. So what organizations do you need to manage this piece of equipment? And that's the whole life of that equipment. So that's, do you now need to have a Tiger team set up to think about midlife upgrades of that capability? But do you need an organization to manage it? Do you need to have more engineers? Where are they going to live? Where are they going to be based? Where are they going to be stationed? Which leads you onto infrastructure. And I'm not going to embarrass the nation, but I'm working on a consultancy project with a government department in another country, and they're buying a piece of equipment, not in the military actually, but they're buying a piece of equipment, and they focus solely on buying the equipment to the point where quite a long way into the project, they didn't know where it was going to live. And this was an airborne platform. So it was an uncrewed drone effectively. And it was quite a way into the process that somebody said, well, we don't have the hangars. We don't have the space to put these things. And that's before they'd even started thinking about training or personnel or any of that kind of stuff. So infrastructure is a really, really important thing. And that's infrastructure when it's in peacetime, when it's going to be in the UK. Where are we going to store these things? If you're buying a ship, do you have the dockside space? Do you have the
dry docks?
Do you have the cranes that can, absolutely, all these things. Logistics. So all equipment needs to be sustained, it needs to be supported, it will create a burden. It might need batteries, it might need fuel, it might need spare parts, it will probably need maintenance, it will probably break down. So straight away, you're now having to go back and think about personnel and equipment and doctor. Do you need to now procure other bits of equipment to support this piece of equipment? If you're buying a ship, do we need to now have a procurement project to look at cranes, or to do a dockyard infrastructure project to development or whatever? And then you've got interoperability. And this last one is about how does it fit within the wider system? How can we leverage this capability to support warfighting, to support defence in the delivery of its operations and missions? So that's the DLODs. That's a really useful framework.
There are going to be people running around and making a complex plan. Now, the question is not whether it's a complex plan, because of, an aircraft carrier, you can't just ignore where people are going to live, the cranes and all that. But I could feel you're building an organization to build complexity. And the statement is, well, this crane isn't quite good enough, so we've got to get them to design this crane, and the crane's late. Here's my question from this, and this is the kind of thing an armchair general says, and on the face of it is actually a bit crass, but there's a bit more to it than that, which is there are certain things that, frankly, no one's ever built one before, so you have to figure it out what you're going to build. Let's pick helicopters.
Yeah.
Right now, the Royal Air Force is, I'm going to get this wrong, is it the Future Modern or the Future Medium Airlift or something? I've got that wrong, but basically the replacement for the Puma. Long discussions. There are people out there going, just buy a Black Hawk now. Go say, never mind all the work you might do, go find the standard military US spec Black Hawk and buy 300 of them, because if you did that, you could buy 300 of them and still have money left over from what you'd have done with the classic way of, well, it can't be like this, it has to be. So my question to you is, when is off the shelf good enough, And when do you need to go build something very specialized?
Yeah, I am so glad you asked that question. And this is something that we talked about with Rob in the last episode, where we got to this point where I think you were questioning the idea of just doing stuff, and if you allowed because we were talking about innovation, if you allowed units to innovate, well, they'd all go off doing their own thing, and you'd end up with 20 units doing the same thing. And the point was, yeah, there'll be inefficiency, there will be mistakes, but actually, I think we all agreed in the end that you would learn more, you would get things done faster, and whilst it would look messy and people could pick holes in it and throw spears at it and say you wasted money there, actually it would be quicker, faster, cheaper and more efficient than the current process, which is trying to over engineer everything from the top down to make sure everything's perfect. And so I absolutely agree. I think these DLODs, training, equipment, personnel, information and intelligence, doctrine and concepts, organisation, infrastructure, logistics and interoperability are absolutely essential to think about. They also are things that you can take risk on, that don't have to be perfect, that you can learn by doing. And I think far too much of what the military does on operations, where we make things work, we accept failure, we accept things aren't always going to go our way, and we accept that we're going to have to adapt to changing circumstances, doesn't transpose over to the way we do project management. And I think a big part of that is, well, there's twofold. One is we don't go out and buy the off-the-shelf solution, which is 70% of what we need, but probably it isn't designed to be ruggedized, or it's the wrong color, or whatever. We could do an awful lot with bits of stuff that is good to go off the market now. A Black Hawk helicopter, for example, if you buy a Black Hawk helicopter, you're not going to get the latest generation helicopter, but you're going to get something that's tried and tested, and it's going to be cheap.
Well, and it will have all of the support equipment designed. You get a lot of that. I mean, by the way, there's a really good example as well, which is where we are near an RAF base. Historically, they would have had Land Rovers. Now they buy Ford pickup trucks.
Yeah.
And so half the vehicles are Ford pickup trucks, which I imagine are a third the price.
Yeah.
Anyone can maintain them and they do the job just fine. I mean, but rather than get into the classic waving fist at the
no, I don't want to.
But here's the question, which is how, because I think, by the way, this is civilian as well.
Yeah.
This is the classic statement that says we need a building and the building needs to be like this, or we need to buy a piece of software. Here's the classic. We need a piece of software that does these 12 things. Well, this piece of software only does 10 of those things. Well, do we say we don't want it? Or do we spend the next 2 years demanding the extra functionality? Or do we say, those are the 12 features we're going to get. Go use them. And we're going to spend a small amount of time working out, do we really care about these other things and what do we do? How do you make that decision? Just that example of, we could buy a bunch of Black Hawks tomorrow. Well, not buy them, but we could get in the queue. How do you make the decision, which is that balance between, here is a set of requirements, which, and I'm not going to say are perfect, but fit our requirements better. We know we have to operate in this environment, and we know the Black Hawk is bad in that environment. This is how it starts.
Yeah.
So therefore we want to change. Versus, well, we'll work that out.
Yeah. So this comes down to, firstly, when I said earlier that the military used to have the monopoly on technology. Of course, they didn't. Innovation and technology has always been far more than just the military. But things like rocketry and aeronautical design, in the early years of those things, they were military government projects. They were
and mostly German, I believe.
Armored vehicle design, ballistics. These classic military procurement projects and capabilities were things that government spent years researching. They didn't want other people to know about it, so it was all in-house, unilateral. That's not the case in a lot of cases nowadays. But our procurement systems are still set up that way. So we have a thing called the CAD mid cycle, which again, a very logical process, and it talks about thinking about the concept. What is it you want? What are the capabilities? What do you need it to do? Then you start assessment. So you look at what technologies are available and what you might want from them, and you start doing some trials. And then you get to the point of demonstration. So you say to BAE Systems or some other arms manufacturer or whichever companies are going to produce the capability, can you demonstrate that you can produce something that's within spec that will meet these capabilities? And then you go through the manufacturing process. Then you have it in service and you manage and maintain and midlife upgrades and all the rest of that stuff. And then at the end of it, you have to dispose of it. And if it's something like a piece of clothing, buying uniforms, it's relatively simple. But of course, the military's buying hundreds of thousands of pieces, so they still have a responsibility to think about disposal. But if it's something like an armored vehicle and all of the subsystems and subcomponents, you've got toxic industrial chemicals, you've got depleted uranium ammunition, you've got heavy metals, you've got stuff that is resellable, so you might be able to make some money back. And the problem with that approach, though, is you want value for money. This is taxpayers' money, and you start the project with this, what is it we want concept, not what is the requirement now. That paradoxically, when we're war fighting, when the risk goes up, we have a thing called urgent operational requirements, which allow us to take all the restraints off, spend money to get kit now because people are dying.
Well, in that case,
and ironically,
in most cases, is that pointing at an off-the-shelf system and saying, I want that?
Absolutely. And there are tweaks to them perhaps, but you're now talking about, yes, it's an off-the-shelf system and we're going to buy it and fly it out in the next 48 hours, or it's an off-the-shelf system and I need it in a different color, but I can get it in theatre in 6 weeks. And if it's a vehicle, or I want that, but I want to bolt some armor onto it, let's do it. What's really interesting is when defense organizations, when nation states are under pressure because they're on operations, because they're at war, they tend to become less worried about being seen to, project manage correctly, getting value for money for the taxpayer, because the imperative is about getting that capability to those that need it now. And what you see is, you end up with stuff that only does 80% of what you probably need it to do, but you've got it now.
And at a cost.
And at a much,
Well,
but what you also then see is really fast innovation cycles.
This is what I was going to say. So I had no idea, but one day, wouldn't it be great to get someone from the Ukrainian military in? We were joking about this just before we came on, which is presumably 3 years ago, there was a Ukrainian colonel who was involved in picking the next X. And if you found the same colonel now, he'd be saying, we don't do that anymore. We were just lucky to get some tanks. The fact that the tanks didn't do what we wanted them to do wasn't interesting. And I think there's a really interesting model, but the bit that I thought was really interesting that you picked up on right then was the iteration. And this comes back to the civilian world. Imagine you are a business and you need to scale. You might imagine, well, what we're going to do is we're going to think very carefully and we're going to buy a big building because then in 3 years we could fit people in that building. Okay, that's not going to happen. What you actually say is, well, we've got enough money today to get this many people, so we'll have this space, then we'll buy another space and we'll figure it out. Hardware, well, this is what we can afford today, and over time we rebuild the truck as it's rolling along the road to suit us. I have to believe that there is an enormous value in, as you say, iterating, which is, well, we got the off-the-shelf Black Hawk. Okay, it didn't do the thing we wanted, so we tried this. That didn't work either, so we tried this. That worked. There's a really great example from history, which is when, after the D-Day landings, and the Allied armies were stuck in the bocages of France, and the bocages are representative of fields, small fields surrounded by hedgerows, frankly, impenetrable hedgerows. And the problem was tanks could not get through these hedgerows. And so there and then, someone cut up some of these hedgehogs, these anti-tank things, which are really bunches of steel welded together.
Yeah.
They cut them up and made prongs, which they welded on the front of the tanks. There is an excellent example of no one before D-Day had thought about this and spent months thinking about it. On the day, they went, we need one of those, try it, do it, bolt it on, and away we go.
Yeah.
I wonder whether this is true both for militaries as it is for civilians. This iterative approach actually gets a better outcome.
Yeah, and this is why in your world, you've moved away from waterfall and towards agile.
So this is agility.
It's agility. It absolutely is. And I think I just want to reiterate the point that defence isn't the only bit of government that struggles with this, and this isn't a UK problem either.
Defence. I mean, as we say, this is project.
But I think there is something here around risk, and what I'd like to do is probably spend the next 10 minutes of the podcast before we draw it to a close, looking at where defence does get this so right on operations and so wrong when they're not on operations, because I think there's some real lessons in that. And risk aversion is a cancerous problem that calcifies organisations, and it's just as bad, if not worse, in defence, where on the face of it we should be quite comfortable with risk, and this is because we end up with this really stark contrast between field commands, frontline commands, organizations that are optimized to operate on operations, and I'm using these words very deliberately, versus management teams and management organizations that are there to support and enable the command element, the field army or the navy that deploys around the world at sea. And what happens is you end up with people being held to account based on their individual project, people being held to account on the success criteria for those projects. If somebody gets killed on operations and they get killed because of enemy action, then that is tragic and it damages morale, and lessons should be and will be learnt. If they get killed because of a decision that's made during a project, a procurement decision, then people might go to jail. There will almost certainly be a public inquiry. And so commanders are willing to put people in harm's way if that harm is enemy action. What commanders aren't willing to do is to take risk on things like the tolerances for safety, the processes. But this is where we get back to what Rob was talking about. What you miss there is the compounding effects. In fact, let's take your Bocage example. There's a really, really good example, which is the 5th Cavalry Regiment in Iraq went into a town called Tal Afar. And what they were finding was in the tight streets of Iraqi cities, little alleyways, 2- and 3-story buildings, driving armoured vehicles, they were vulnerable. Very similar to the Bocage. And what they got on their Humvees, these armoured vehicles, were these massive ballistic plates for the top gunner to protect them from RPGs and small arms. And to move this giant ballistic protected sort of fortification on the top of the Humvee, they had to rotate it round, which meant their guns were slow to respond. And the gun they had was a big heavy weapon. They had 50 caliber machine guns on the top of these vehicles. And what they realized was they just weren't quick enough to respond to people popping out with an RPG from 50, 100 meters, firing an RPG and disappearing. So they cut these things off, and they started, instead of going out with the top gunner with a 50 caliber machine gun and ballistically protected, a top gunner who is less protected but more agile with a shotgun. and they were able to stop these attacks happening. Somebody back in the US got wind of the fact that the commander of this unit had allowed people to cut these ballistic shields off, and it started a Pentagon investigation because that was seen as reckless. Because if somebody had been killed because they didn't have ballistic protection, that is an American decision. Whereas if somebody gets killed and they do have the ballistic protection, well, that's just a tragedy of war. And what you end up doing is you stifle that innovation.
You've kind of touched on this, but the challenge here is that is driven by jeopardy. With jeopardy, a commander feels very comfortable saying what is the right decision now.
Yes.
The moment you move out of this jeopardy, and again, I want to bring this back to the civilian world, for smart people who need to take informed risks as opposed to mavericks who just do stuff because they think it's cool, the further you are from jeopardy, the harder it is to do that.
Yeah.
So if you say, we are going to go out of business next week unless we deliver these widgets on time, if you do that, you've created a civilian version of jeopardy, and you watch when people go, well, what if I did X or Y? When you don't have that jeopardy, people go, well, there's not much we can do. What's the worst that will happen? So I don't know how you create jeopardy without inviting people to come at you with a gun or a knife.
Well,
but that's the trick, isn't it? Same outcome, but without the jeopardy.
So there's several things. One is, on operations, the military tends to be very, very good at being responsive and agile to the situation because of all the things we've talked about in previous episodes. So they delegate authority, they delegate decision making. You push the decisions down to the point where the information is coming in fast enough that the decisions are relevant. If you centralize, you are further away from that jeopardy. The second thing is that risk aversion. So when you're at war, that risk is staring you in the face every day. You are seeing those helicopters coming in with the casualties. You are smelling the burning vehicles as the smoke drifts across the town. You are, every day you're going out the wire, feeling the adrenaline. If you're a commander sending people out the gate, you are feeling that adrenaline, you're feeling that responsibility. If you're a procurement team, procuring a weapon system or a piece of capability for a notional conflict that may or may not ever happen, and you are 10 years out from the development of this capability, and you're getting caught up in the day-to-day political conversations, and then at 5 o'clock you go home every day, and this is your job, this isn't life and death, you're so far detached that risk aversion creeps in. So one of the things we do on operations, and we've talked about before, the idea of wargaming, the idea of red teaming, the idea of getting people just to think about what the adversary will be doing, what the competitor will be doing, what is the worst case scenario. So you plan for the worst, hope for the best. You work out what the most likely, what the most dangerous course of actions are going to be. What are the high impact, low probability risks? What are the high probability, low impact risks? How am I going to balance those things? Wargaming, thinking about and playing through in the most visceral way you can, brings that jeopardy back. And this is where, in the corporate world, one of the things I do is I create spaces to allow people to move away from the 9 to 5 drudgery of answering emails and going to meetings to actually, and sometimes, we roll out a map and roll dice or place cards, get people to think about, well, what if this happens? Well, what are you going to do?
There's a simpler version of that as well, which it's easy to bypass, which is go spend time with the people that are going to feel the effect of what you're doing. So
yes.
In my world, this is anyone who's in the world of product management, of course, they roll their eyes and say, well, of course, Chris, but it's worth calling it out, which is people who are responsible for, in inverted commas, designing and building software should spend some time with the people who are going to be using that software, because otherwise there's a risk you end up being focused on the process rather than the outcome. And so I think the red teaming and the war gaming is a really good way of trying to bring that jeopardy to life in a safe way. In the civilian world, it's less someone's going to shoot at me. It is, oh, I care about Bob or Jane because I sat with them for 3 hours. Did you know that they have to type this thing in 35 times? Jane says she wasn't going to get home to her kid's birthday on time tonight because she has to spend an hour or two doing. We can. How do you bring that jeopardy to people?
I think also having a czar or an advocate for looking at the problem holistically and looking at what are the consequences of not doing things holistically. And what I mean by that is when you are responsible for the delivery of a project, you are measured on the consequences of that project. When several projects within a program start to compound those safety margins or the extra checks that you've added into the process, the fail safes, what sometimes you create is even more risk by the fact that your risk aversion is preventing flexibility and agility. But you won't notice that unless somebody is looking at the program holistically. And so we have got to a situation now where air safety rules, because of peacetime operations in the military, air safety rules are run by the Civilian Air Authority, the CAA, and rightly so, we are shaving margins of percentages off risk by putting extra steps in place. Nobody, or not until recently, has been looking at how does that create a culture that when you need to take all of those restraints off in a warfighting situation, how do we do that? What are the impacts on training, equipment, personnel, information and intelligence, doctrine and concepts, organisation? So we're at a point now where we're not practicing things that we are going to do. So there's a mantra in the military, which is, train as you fight. Because of safety rules, we talked about this in a previous podcast when I talked about firing ranges and the safety margins and the fact that in my first tour of Afghanistan, they took some of those safety margins out and it was a lot closer to real world operations. And of course it's riskier, but because you're about to go out the gate, that's justified. And by the time I went back for my second combat tour, that had all been removed. And so we went from huge safety margins to warfighting. And that was a huge psychological shock.
It reminds me of a conversation we've had, which is, this really does, I think about this sort of every day, which is we've talked about in any world, whether it's civilian or military, knowing when to be innovative, knowing when to break the rules, knowing when to iterate and do the right thing. And the fear I always have is that one man's I did it because I need to be innovative is another man's the rules don't apply to me. And I'm cool, I don't care. And I wonder whether there's this element here of this being thoughtful about removing risk so that I would almost argue by doing that, you got closer to war fighting and therefore you were better at knowing when to take risks and not to take risks. I wonder if there's a civilian equivalent, which is how do I make sure that my team don't become the hero for the day and fail miserably versus the person who takes a calculated, thoughtful risk, might fail, but it's okay. I'd actually ask you to do that again. As opposed to the other guy, which is like, you're just a liability to me. It's such a tricky one.
It is, but I think Paul Tremelling was the guest we had that I think summed this up the best, which was the rules are there, the policies are there, and they're in place, and they've been written in blood, and they are there for a reason. And it's only when they get in the way of you doing your job that you even consider removing them. What you don't want to do is get to a position where that consideration just doesn't exist at all. And policy gets in the way, and the rules get in the way of thinking about consequence, rather than the rules don't apply to me because I'm special.
Yeah, and it comes right back round to the very beginnings of what we usually come up with, which is you've got to be intelligent, smart, and thoughtful to be able to understand the difference between the two. Look, let's call it a day here. I don't think we were ever going to solve procurement in the military. I think this has been for me a really interesting exploration about complexity, the challenges, and what a surprise it turns out that military procurement is not unlike other projects in the world. I think we are virtually raising a glass to all the poor sods in mod main building who have one tour or half a tour to make a difference in a project that's going to last multiple people doing 3 tours. So anyone out there who is working out the future vertical lift, good luck. Black Hawks would be great. As always, thank you for listening. Please tell your friends, subscribe. Please rate and review because that helps the algorithms. Please contact us on email, battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com, battlingwithbiz. That's it for tonight. Thank you for joining us. But I hope that was an interesting insight into perhaps one of the lesser trod paths of management as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I think when we talk about military leadership, we dwell on commander leadership in combat operations. There is a huge amount of hard work that goes on, and there are a huge amount of unsung heroes that have put blood, sweat, and tears into getting the kit and equipment right to support the warfighter. And so there's an awful lot of procurement projects that go really well. It's the bad ones that end up in the headlines. So on that note, thanks very much and goodbye.
See you soon.